Eu queria apresentar um crítico de arte norte-americano, Robert Morgan, Robert Monica. Bom, ele nasceu em Boston, mas ele vive em Nova York. E, sim, ele é um professor também universitário, ele dá aula no Pratt Institute em Nova York, dá aula também na Escola de Artes Visuais, SBA, em Nova York. E tem várias graduações aí, etc. Então, é necessário mencionar mais. Muitos livros publicados, mais de 10 títulos publicados, de textos, assim, inúmeros textos. Tem viajado o mundo inteiro, fazendo exposições em vários lugares, inclusive na Ásia, tem estado muito presente na Coreia, tem estado muito presente na China. E acho que é isso. Então, o Robert Morgan vai falar sobre um tema que pertence também a um livro, o título de um livro que ele escreveu já, foi publicado em 1998 na Argentina, sobre o fim do mundo da arte. Né? E, enfim, esse aqui é o Robert Morgan, e ele vai falar sobre esse assunto.
Thank you, Daniel. Welcome. Listen, if there's a problem with the English, you have to let me know and I can try and explain something that you may have missed, okay? And if I can't explain it, my friend has just volunteered to clarify any words that may not have transmitted in relation to the idea, okay? I want to thank Isabel for inviting me. Isabel Plata, thank you for this invitation to come to Escola San Paulo. And Daniel, this is a delight for me because Daniel, I don't know if you mentioned in the introduction, but he was a graduate student of mine 22 years ago. And we have managed to stay in touch. Since then, I've written about his work on a few occasions. And my new friend, Marco Giovannotti, who is sitting over there, it's a pleasure to have you here with us as you listen to a few comments that I'm going to make on this rather contentious title called The End of the Art World. Now, let me begin by explaining that that was the title of a book. Isabel, do you have that book I gave you by any chance?
Not today.
Yeah. Back in 1998, I was in Argentina, and okay, she will find the book. Anyway, the point is that this is a lecture that I gave in 1995 at the Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And then it was printed in a journal called Art Criticism by another critic named Donald Cuspid. And then I was invited in 1996 to Buenos Aires, and I gave the lecture there, and I received quite an enthusiastic response, so much so that the director of the museum, Jorge Bluesberg, did you ever know him by any chance? No? Jorge Bluesberg arranged a session the following day to answer any questions regarding the talk. But I have to say that it was published in 1998, so for me, are rather old ideas, okay? So what I'm going to do, with your permission, is to bring it into the present in terms of some work that I've been doing over the last almost 20 years, okay? Because 18 years is a long time. But I was quite concerned with the state of what is called the art world in New York, obviously, which is where I live and work, and how this was having too much control in terms of the thinking of artists and their ability to produce work that was significant into being conformist in terms of some kind of vague idea of what the trend should be in art. So the book was a response to this abundance of trends that were coming into art, because I'm much more interested in individual artists and what they are trying to do, because I think this is the real position of art and the real position of the artist. That it's not about agreement and conformity, it's about taking a definitive position for yourself in terms of the problems you are trying to respond to in relation to your own work. So I made this distinction between the art world, which is essentially the support system for art, which would include galleries, museums, and would include collectors. Now keep in mind this was almost 20 years ago, and history has recontextualized a lot of this. Because in those days we used to have something called critics, who presumably had some influence in the art. Now I would venture to say that critics, for the most part, have either disappeared, or they have become art writers or journalists. Because if you're an art writer, you do not have to take a position. You just write about art. You talk about the descriptive aspects of the work. You talk about maybe what other artists are connected with this group or this style or this appearance, but you don't really talk about the art in a critical way. Now, I believe that for a healthy art environment to exist, that criticism is essential. If there's no criticism, there's no dialogue. If there's no dialogue, there's no forward motion in terms of a cultural development that art is inciting. So the alternative that I came up with in that book was that instead of saying that artists were part of the art world, why not have a community of artists that were separate from the support system, which were the galleries, the museums, and the collectors, and critics somewhere in between at that time, because the critics were important in terms of defining what artists were doing to a large extent. But why not have a community of artists that would support one another and would establish places to show work on their own without commercial interests in order to develop in the sense that one has ideas somehow can come together in terms of form. Now, you might be interested to know that I was the first, when I was doing, I have an MFA and a PhD. When I went to New York University to do my PhD, I chose to do my dissertation on conceptual art. I wrote the first dissertation on conceptual art, and that was followed by a number of books. Some of them were translated into Spanish, including one that was translated by Escola in Madrid. Okay? I'm looking forward to my first Portuguese translation, which Daniel is going to help me out with, and perhaps Marco as well. But anyway, the point is this, that the end of the art world was how can we reduce this pressure coming from the establishment of commercial interests? How can we reduce this in order to free artists, in order to liberate artists to create art in their own terms? Okay, so that they feel that being in the studio is okay. All right, it's okay. It's okay to be a singular artist in your studio working. Nothing wrong with that. You don't have to go out to all the parties and all the openings and get ready. Network. Network was a word that you never heard 20 years ago. Now you hear it all the time. And the reason to go to openings is not to look at the work, but to network. Okay, you know who's going to be there. And how do you promote your career at the expense of someone else, because it's very competitive now. Artists are not helping each other the way they used to back in the 70s. I know, because I was around at that time. I was part of the art world. I was part of trying to build an artist community that could distance itself from the support system, but at the same time be honorable and dignified in relation to it. Because the support system is not necessarily bad. It's the way it gets corrupted that makes it problematic, and the way it exerts pressure on artists that is problematic. So the title of the book, The End of the Art World, is about how do we reduce that pressure on artists so that artists, get ready, can be artists. How do we allow artists to be artists and to evolve their ideas and their credibility and their presence in terms of what they are trying to present? How do we regenerate a sense of forward motion in terms of art? Because I got news for you. Right now, we're not going anywhere. We're going round and around and around. And the market has incited this because of the enormous control in New York, particularly. I mean, it's also in China, it's also in Europe to a certain extent. But you really feel it. And I'm speaking, of course, from a New York perspective. Okay? I do have some notes, Daniel, and I know I promised you that I would not use notes because Daniel used to hate it when he was my student if I pulled out notes. I can see he would get all nervous and he would get disoriented, when I pulled out my notes. So Daniel, forgive me for doing this, but I just want to make sure that I'm not leaving anything out. Oh, yes, one important point that I wanted to talk about is perhaps the reason why critics decline in terms of their presence in the art world. There's no money in it. Okay? There's a lot of money in the galleries, a lot of money in the museums, and a lot of money in the collectors. Critics, who needs it? They just get in the way. They just confuse things. So, if somebody says, I'm going to buy a Gerhard Richter, and you have a critic saying, well, maybe you should think about that. Now, in fact, we were having a conversation earlier, and I'm very fond of what Richter is doing for a number of reasons, aesthetic reasons. But I'm also very fond of the fact that he is the first artist in that caliber who has criticized the market for the kinds of prices that are being claimed for his work. I've never heard of this happen before. In other words, he's saying, you're paying too much for this work. It's not that important. He's saying this. And hopefully this will have an influence on other artists in that echelon of importance to say, these prices are absurd. And they are absurd. We are at a point now, folks, where whatever used to be qualitative in terms of a work of art, significant in terms of a work of art, is completely divorced from the money. I remember when I came to New York in 1975, that if a Picasso sold for $125,000, we're talking about 1975, and believe it or not, you could find a Picasso for $125,000. Okay? Can't anymore. All right? But I remember thinking, well, it is Picasso. It's a high price, but it makes sense because he's an important artist. Like Matisse or Duchamp or Mondrian is one of the four great artists, I suppose, of the 20th century. And this was in 1975, so $125,000. But now, when you hear these prices in the millions, and I can tell you, for very mediocre art, and most of it, I'm sorry to say, comes out of the United States. Okay? Not all of it, but most of it. Okay? We have people that are mistaking art for kitsch. Kitsch is a kind of rearguard aesthetic that was discussed by Clement Greenberg as early as 1939 in his essay, Avant-Garde and Kitsch. He said that avant-garde is the front line of development and innovation in art, then kitsch is in the rear. Okay? It was a very important point. But most of the money is going for kitsch that's disguised as art. Okay? I'm not going to mention names because when I'm being critical of an issue, I don't want to confuse that with arts. Okay? I mean, obviously there are artists that are making certain kinds of work that comes out of a kind of popular culture idea, or a television idea, or the political idea, whatever it is. And for some reason, there's unlimited cash for this work. But to look at a painting that is simply an important work of art, somehow the cash is always a little short. Okay? You understand what I'm saying? That if you go for the mediocre, which everybody understands, unlimited cash. But if you go for something truly significant, gee, you know, that deal didn't go through last week. Sorry, I can't buy it right now. But the next day, oh, that balloon dog, sure, 50 million, no problem. You understand what I'm saying? Okay, I told you I wouldn't mention any names, right? All right. But I think you get the picture. All right. One of the other points I talked about in the end of the art world is the difference between inner-directed artists and outer-directed artists. Now, my remarks from a moment ago suggested that I am in favor of the inner-directed artist. The artist, male or female, black or white, Jew or Gentile, it doesn't make any difference. That's not the issue. The issue is, do they have the confidence and the will and the desire to produce something significant? Okay? This is the issue. It takes a lot of work, a lot of concentration, a great deal of focus, and a great deal of energy expended the right way. I think to be a great artist, you have to have a lifestyle that is oriented toward what you're trying to do. Okay? As Clement Greenberg used to say, I knew Clement Greenberg very well, and I did a book on him later in my career. He used to say, a great artist has to have great character. But just because the artist has great character doesn't guarantee he or she is going to be a great artist. You understand? Maybe. Okay. I think that that's true, but you know, I'm not sure that the term character, in the way Greenberg was using that term, is really understood today. I think that perhaps the younger generation understands character as movie stars on the screen. Okay? Now that's very different than the kind of character, which means, shall we say, an ethical position that is somehow balanced in relation to aesthetics, which comes out, guess where? From Immanuel Kant. Not so bad. Not so bad. It used to be considered, well, ethics. No, it's the aesthetics. It's what you see. You know something? If you still believe that, you know, you're in another century. Because we've discovered, and not so recently, by the way, that there is a synaptical charge between the retina and the hemisphere of the brain. And that synaptical charge that we see can produce thought. So therefore, the observation and the thinking about art is inextricably bound to one another. We see and we think and we see. Okay? We cannot just say, oh, I like it, without thinking. Okay? This is the problem. You know, there's the assumption that I know what I like. What does that mean? Now, the fact is that we have to take art seriously, and if we take it seriously, then we're going to expect a higher quality of collector and a higher quality of the art. But we have to be united in this idea. That we really believe that art has to be intelligent. We really believe that art has to be significant. And we have to believe that there's some qualitative aspect that is meaningful in what we're trying to do. Okay. Now, I want to come up to date a little bit. I began to notice around this time, shortly after this book came out, that there was starting to be an interesting clash between critics and editors of magazines. And I remember a magazine a number of years ago called Arts Magazine. It was one of the oldest magazines in New York. And the publisher would go up to the floor in the elevator, and there would be desks over here and desks over here. And I would say, why do you have desks over here and desks over here? I said, because these are for advertising, and these are for editorial. And I don't want the two to become confused. In other words, what is the commercial interest in terms of advertising should be kept separate from editorial decisions. Well, this guy ended up losing so much money from people that refused to pay because the criticism was not positive. In other words, they assumed that if they were going to take out an ad in Arts Magazine, that they were going to get some kind of positive review that they could Xerox and put on top of their table or send out. And keep in mind, this is before the days of the internet, but still the same thing exists today. It's immediate. I recently wrote something for a Chinese gallery because I'm very involved in going to China, and I've written literally hundreds of reviews, and I've been translating into Chinese. I was the first critic, American critic, to actually be translated in China, and that was in 2013. It had to go through 4 levels of censorship from the Communist Party to get published. But I was in very close touch with my translator, and he said, believe me, the significant stuff did not change. They were concerned about certain words, and they were concerned about, when you mentioned the name Mao Zedong, that you said, Chairman Mao. Okay? These kinds of things. They got published. But anyway, the point is that I began to see that this separation that my publisher was making 20 years ago is now inextricably bound together. There is no review unless there is some kind of commercial interest involved. Okay? This is a fact, not an opinion. It's a fact. All right? That if you want a review, there has to be a commercial interest that is concrete. Okay? It has to be an ad, it has to be a check, it has to be something. Okay? I'm talking about one of the big magazines. Now, if you talk to people from the big magazines, of course, they will deny it because it's always indirect. You understand what I'm saying? And therefore, there's no way you can say, oh, this and this. It's always kind of behind the scenes, but it's always there. One of the things when I was working with a magazine in Italy that I really respected is that my publisher there in Milan was very direct. He said, tell this artist that if he gives me a painting, I'll put him on the cover. No problem. No problem. But in the United States, you're never going to, and of course the Americans were very critical of that. The Americans were doing exactly the same, only for much more money. Indirectly. You understand what I'm saying? You understand what I'm saying? Yeah, okay. All right. So the role of the editors began to take on commercial interests, and it created a great deal of confusion and some. Okay. In other words, if there was because they don't see any alternative to this conformity and this production can I do? Okay? It's instilled in the art world at this point. And I'm not afraid to say that. Okay. And then we have academic rhetoric that is coming into certain kinds of criticism. I suppose more in journals, more in books. And there are publishers who, book publishers now, who are completely tied into the system. And the academic rhetoric is very predictable in terms of the word usage, in terms of the position, in terms of the analysis. In other words, everyone is doing the same thing, which is what the academy is about. Everyone does the same. It's like they're rewriting their dissertation 50, 100 times. Okay? That's not criticism. Criticism is where you speak your mind and you take a risk because you're struggling for the language that can somehow fit the situation of where the work is. Real criticism is always this kind of struggle with finding the right kind of words to talk about the work. This, is a disadvantage for the critic if you look at it from that point of view, but I always find it a challenge because there's no formula for criticism. Absolutely no formula. What happened to the odd guy? Oh, sure. Being facetious. Yeah. I thought you would get tired of my sense of humor. Okay. So what I'm suggesting is that the academy from the grease and oil of the market. Okay? You just find the right art historian or critic, okay? Get them to write the article, and suddenly everything is copacetic. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the term critic is rarely used nowadays. Coming here to Buenos Aires, where are we? We're in Brazil, aren't we? Sao Paulo, yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ray. Anyhow, sometimes the jokes aren't so good, right? 100%.
No, we don't think he's.
Huh?
In Brazil, no, I think.
You're just jealous of the tango. You know what I mean? She's a great dancer. You know. Anyway, the term criticism now is being replaced by, can you guess? What is the word? Right. Journalism. So you come in and you have the energy to engage in this kind of language criticism. You say, oh, you're the journalist. Oh, yeah, you go over here. Okay. In other words, you're here to report, not to question. Okay. Now there's another term that has become synonymous with this. It's called, get ready, art writer. What does that mean? Art writer. Okay. I guess it means you write about art. If you don't say anything critical, watch out, or you're going to be in trouble. Okay. Now, I would make a distinction between the, shall we say, the intellectual and the academician. Because I think that there's a connotation that the intellectual is really seeking for individual truth in the experience of the work that he or she is looking at. Whereas the academic is looking for a formula that will agree with whoever the academic sponsor happens to be, whether it's a magazine or an institution. Okay? I went through the ranks, became a full professor, and now I'm something called a professor emeritus. Okay? And I decided at the age of 58, which was 16 years ago, that I would retire. You know why? Because I felt that even though I was perfectly safe in terms of my tenure, all that stuff, all the bonuses, all that stuff, I said, no, I don't want to do it anymore. I don't want to do it anymore. Because I don't want the psychology of that entering into the way I write and the way I think. Okay? So they said, well, okay, you're a professor emeritus. I said, fine, but I don't want to come back here and teach. I'll be professor emeritus. Okay, that's great, no problem. Okay. And by the way, do I get my dental insurance?
You know, and I never told you this, but you know, when I was younger, when I'd go for a job interview, you know what I would do? You know, with the guy interviewing me, I would say, okay, let's put our cards on the table. What? I said, let's put our cards on the table. Do you offer dental insurance? Isn't that great? See, you have to be a little original. You know, you can't say the same thing that everybody else does. You know what I'm saying? God, you know, some people, they're slow learners. You're not going to question that. Okay. I don't want to interrupt you. No, he's building up the ammunition. Okay. I know. He's building up. I can see the steam is coming out of his ears. You know, pretty soon. I'm going to pay for it. All right. So anyway, there used to be something in New York that we called a discourse, which was a kind of dialogue. All right. In other words, if the critic did a studio visit, it would be a conversation. And sometimes it would be relatively positive, and sometimes relatively negative, whatever, but there would be a conversation, okay? And this conversation was always about what the artist was trying to do, what is now called the artist's intention, okay? And how is the intention fitting with the work that we're seeing around the studio? Where is the connection, okay? Now, this was the beginning of a discourse because at one time, critics were going to studio visits. They don't do that because there are so few critics around. They're only art writers and journalists, okay? We don't know what to say because they're uneducated. They don't know it. But in the old days, there were people that really knew and that could talk to the artist in an intelligent way and create this kind of dialogue. Now, what I am looking for at this point is something that I'm borrowing from the great 20th century philosopher and theologian Martin Buber. Martin Buber was one of the really great philosophers of the 20th century, in my opinion. And he talked about something called the dialogical encounter. The dialogical encounter is where two people come together and begin talking. And they talk until the point where they feel something is so true that they have to talk no more. Okay? They just have found that point of revelation, okay, in terms of, in this case, art. Now, that's a beautiful thing, okay? It takes time, but what's wrong with that, you know? Sometimes, you know, listen, I've got one of these, okay, like everyone in this room. You know, this has taken our time away. How many of you leave this at home and take a walk in the woods? In the park, whatever. You know, no, it's not so bad. You know what I'm saying? You have an hour and a half where this is not with you. Not so bad. We need to restore a sense of our mentality, in terms of our physical health, in terms of knowing who we are, and in terms of our ability to engage in biological encounter. Okay? That is essential to art. I really believe this. I really believe it. Okay. Now, we are at a point, I believe, right now, which has to do with the structural paradigm introduced by Claude Levi-Strauss and Jean Piaget many years ago in the 20th century. And this idea had to do with two forms of time. Diachronic time, which was about the progression in history. For example, in the West, we have this idea going back to the late 18th century. It begins with the Grande Manière, and then it goes into classicism, neoclassicism, and then it goes to Romanticism, then it goes to Naturalism, then to Impressionism, then to Post-Impressionism, then to Cubism, okay? Now, there's a progression in time, you know, over a little more than a century, maybe 110 years or so, okay? That you go through these steps and you finally arrive at Cubism, right? And then it continues, of course, with the avant-garde in Zurich, with the surrealists, with the abstraction création in Paris, very important movement that people forget about, the abstract expressionists, the pop artists, the conceptual artists, the postmodernists, and so forth. Okay, this is diachronic time. Are you with me on this? This is a progression of history. Okay, that is defined at these various steps. Now, Piaget, who is in fact a psychologist, a child psychologist, been very interested in the maturation of children in terms of how they develop. And he would make comparisons between that and history, which was interesting. Okay? He said sometimes we have to look at the synchronic cut-through. In other words, what is happening in 1965 worldwide? Not just in terms of this historical progression, but what is happening at that moment in the world. That's where we are now. And the new technology, information technology, has made this possible. And I remember the curator of the museum saying, but Robert, that's very negative. I said, no. It's only negative because it's so overwhelming to think in these terms, but we have to think in these terms because it's the future. We can be in touch with over 1,000 cultures if we consider the archipelago of Indonesia. For example, not be facetious, but all of these cultures have diachronic histories. All of them. They all have their roots in the past. They all have developed from the past to where we are right now. Now, one of the great benefits of postmodernism, and there aren't that many, because I've been very critical of certain aspects of the cynicism of postmodernism, which a lot of people like to use in order to do this kind of achievement. But I'm not cynical, okay? And I'm not against selling art. Let's get that clear. I'm against corruption, for sure. And I'm against pretension, for sure. But listen, we're at a point now that I think is so exciting in terms of our access to the synchronic moment. We can go anywhere and find out what's happening. Now, this raises the question, doesn't it? If we can go anywhere and find out what's happening, what is contemporary? Okay? You understand what I'm trying to say? What is contemporary? Who is more contemporary than anyone else? Because everybody now has their own diachronic history. We know that. Okay? And we can look at this lateral spread. So to talk about contemporary art, who is contemporary art are we talking about? And I think the Americans have to wake up. America is not the last word, as much as they thought so 20 years ago. Okay? I do a lot of traveling, and I do it by invitation. And I'm invited to these places like Iran, where I've been twice. And I always see wonderful art, sometimes truly significant, sometimes art that makes me weep, but it's so great. You know what I don't do? Because I don't represent a museum or an academy anymore. I told you I took my retirement. I'm still teaching, but I'm not teaching as a full-time professor. But do we really need this, or? It's noisy. It's kind of no. I'll be finished in a minute and turn it. My point is this: that going to these places, I never go to the important gallery and say, "Gee, tell me the 5 artists that I should visit." I don't do that. I don't do that. I do it on my own, and I find out what I think is interesting. I'll listen to galleries, of course, but I'm not there to, promote their artists, which is what they're trying to do, obviously. I think it's a great time. I call it the synchronic moment. It's going to be the title of my next book. Okay? Because this is where we are now. This is where we have a magnanimous opportunity to get rid of the negativism, get rid of the cynicism, and to move into a truly new era where we are communicating, to redefine the social in relation to the individual. Okay, that's so important. Rather than you conform to, how about something you contribute to? Rather than being constantly pulled into the spectacle, how about forgetting the spectacle and becoming yourself and offering something that is vital and that is human and that is significant and that is exciting? I think that's what artists want. I think that's what artists want. They want to feel that every day. But why? Boyce, Joseph Boyce, I don't know if you're familiar with this artist. He was an artist of the 20th century. He died in 1987, I believe. 86, sorry. 1986. We'll hold that in 87. Boyce had this idea that he called the Great Dialogue. And the Great Dialogue was when people were released from the pressures that institutions were imposing upon them. And they could speak their mind. They could speak what they really felt, and they could address their needs in relation to one another. The Great Dialogue, we call it. It was a visionary position. But that's kind of crosses over with Uber on a certain level, and it kind of gets to this idea of the dialogical, the synchronic encoding. Okay? Now, I have to say that the dialogical is embedded within the synchronic. It's not like they're completely separate, because in order to analyze any form of art history or art, you have to know where the roots are and address those roots anywhere we want at this moment. And therefore, the issue of who is more contemporary than somebody else, dealers can no longer use that as a way of selling art. They can't say that so-and-so is ahead of all the other artists. How do they know that? Have they done the survey? Have they really gone out and seen for themselves what is out there in terms of the amazing energy and wealth of creative involvement that is in various cultures in the world? But I have to say, the more I travel and the more I go to these places, the more I am encouraged. And I'm thinking in a way that is very different than many of my colleagues, at least I feel that. Let's begin, again, talking about art rather than marketing of art, because it prevents the forward motion that we need, the release of kind of energy that we need. Let's generate art as a form of dialogue, a dialogical encounter, to use Buber's term, and regain a sense of selfhood in the process, committed to the presence of art. Restructuring the meaning of the social and the cultural, not through essentialism, which is divisionary and divisive, but through the vigor of belief in what we are. To set an example of a more qualitative and humble way of life. Beneath. West. Okay, I guess we can open it for questions.
It's amazing because when you